Now that you know a little more about research methods, it will be easier to interpret the articles that you have to read for class. A journal article is really different from a newspaper article, from a magazine article, from reading a textbook, and from reading a novel. Scientists, including psychologists, publish the results of our research in what we call peer-reviewed journals. These journals are really selective. They're very picky. The good ones get hundreds of submissions every month, but they only publish like 8 to 10 of them. So how do they choose? There's a blind review process, meaning that the editor sends the article to 3 experts in the field who don't know the author's names, and the author doesn't know the peer reviewers either. It's double blind most of the time. The reviewers read the article, they critique it, they give feedback on it, and then they suggest whether or not they think it should be published. They can give multiple different suggestions. They could say, this study doesn't fit this journal at all. Sorry, go try and submit it somewhere else. Or try and replicate your study because it wasn't constructed well. They might say, accept with revisions. Okay, this is pretty good, but here's some suggestions you need to fix in your writing, and then we will accept it after you turn it back in. And there's also just accept without revisions, which is incredibly rare. I have been both an author and a reviewer, so I hope to give you a little bit of insight into that so that you can kind of put on those reviewer glasses and be able to write as a scientific author on your survey research paper. So once a study gets to the point that you are reading it in a journal, it has already made it past several rounds of editing, probably before it ever got submitted to the journal, and then it's gotten a lot of feedback from peer reviewers and a lot of weeding out of stuff that didn't make it. So by the time it's there, it's already had a lot of eyes on it, sort of like your studies will be by the end of the semester after you and I have worked together on improving it. For this mini lecture, we're going to be talking about the sleep and studying article that I posted on Canvas. So please feel free to follow along with it or maybe read it ahead of time so that you have an idea of what's going on. So let's talk about how to read a journal article, meaning how do I get through all this really complicated mumbo jumbo to figure out the take-home message? You're going to learn how to answer questions like, what do the researchers expect to happen and why? What did they actually do and what did they find? What were the outcomes? This paper I posted is called To Study or to Sleep, the academic cost of extra studying at the expense of sleep. Part of how we can learn to answer these questions is by learning the pieces of a typical APA-style journal article. They tend to follow a standard format. They have an abstract, introduction, method, results, discussion, and a reference section. And even in different disciplines, even if it's not exactly APA style, they may have slightly different header names for these sections, but they follow the same format. So let's look at each section one at a time. An abstract is a really great tool to help you figure out whether you should read the rest of this paper or not. It's a brief summary of the whole article from introduction to conclusions in somewhere around 150 words. APA style is, I think, 100 to 250 words, but every journal has slight variations on different styles. This is really helpful when you're writing papers later this semester because you need to read the abstract of this article to figure out if it's relevant or not without having to slog through the whole thing because they can take a long time to read. They're kind of dense. So for the sleep article, here's what our abstract looks like. You can usually find it right under the title and the author's names. Read this first. It gives us a brief summary here. We know that our participants are adolescents. We know something about what they did. They kept a diary about their sleep and study habits. And we can tell the results quickly too. They found that the more you sacrifice sleep, the more trouble you're going to have understanding things in class. The introduction is our next section, and it usually is the longest part of a paper. It lays the foundation for a study, and it tells us what the authors expected to happen and why. It answers questions like what was already known about this topic before they conducted the study? What were the gaps in the knowledge that needed to be filled? And what do we expect to find in our study? For this class, I advise you to skip to the very end of the introduction. You can go back and read the introduction later, but really to get into the main points of what happened in the article, go ahead and skip down to the current study section, or it might say the present study, or occasionally something like rationale. This section has a very brief summary of how they designed their study and what they predicted to find, their hypotheses. For the sleep study, the intro is on the first 2 pages, and if you look at the bottom of the second page, and I've got an arrow pointing at it here, they have a subheading that says current study. That's where you can go ahead and flip to and find exactly what their hypotheses were. For our methods, this is the nitty-gritty of what the researchers did. Who were their participants? How did they recruit them? And what were their ages, race, gender, etc.? It's broken into subsections that have to do with participants. Materials and measure tells you what tools they used for their study. For the purpose of this class, you won't really need to focus on materials and measures quite as much. It might have too much nitty-gritty detail. It tells you how they measured their main variables though. So if I were measuring parent and child interaction, how would I do that? This is the section you would look at. Procedure is very important. This is like the step-by-step recipe, the how-to guide for what they did, starting in a chronological order. The results section shows you how they supported their findings with statistics. You can't just say, here's what we did, and it worked. You have to show your evidence, and in this case, we do that with statistics. Were the experimental and the control group different from each other? How different were they? Was it statistically significantly different, like you learned about in your stats classes? It's helpful to glance at tables for results and also figures, graphs, to get a quick visual of what they found. If we look at this table from the sleep study, we can tell from the p-values that are less than 0.05 whether there was a significant effect of sleep time on academic problems. The discussion is a summary of findings in the words, not numbers. So it sort of restates results, but in a way that's a little more interpretable. They also give you a connection to previous literature. So do our findings match up with what previous researchers had done? They talk about the limitations to their study too. This is important. They talk about those threats to internal and external validity. And then they project into the future, thinking about what future research questions could spin off from this study. What are some questions we now need to answer? What are some ways we could have improved upon this study if we're going to replicate it, if other researchers wanted to do it over again? And what are the implications for the real world? Can our findings help people in some way? The discussion section is really a good place to look for the take-home message. So this is where, if you're trying to figure out why should we care about this research, what do we do with this information, this section is for you. It sums everything up really well, and it tells you how the findings fit in with a bigger picture. It also describes what needs to come next after this study is completed. Sometimes I find articles that I think are going to be relevant to a paper that I'm writing based on when I read the abstract. So then I'll skip to the discussion to learn more about whether it's really relevant. And then we end with the reference section. Here's an example of what one looks like. They have the full APA style references that they use to back up their study. And why would you ever want to read this part? You don't want to just read a list of references. It's boring. But you want to check whether they cited reputable sources. Are they citing blog posts and, web articles, or are they citing peer-reviewed research as well? And you can go and read those studies and see if what they're saying that the research says is actually what that research says. It's also a great place to use that treeing method that we talked about in the Finding Sources lecture so that you can find more relevant sources for your paper. Look through this and you could find more papers about sleep habits. They would cite a lot of other important articles in that field. And to get a sense of which articles in this reference might be useful to you, this is where I might skip back to the introduction and read all that, because that's where they tend to cite all these other people and review the literature that came before them. So that is a good place to find new sources, is by reading their introduction too. And that's all I have for you now. Remember to complete the How to Read a Research Article assignment. Thanks, and have a good week.